part 1 of this series, I am going to make this cockpit look busy. I'm also going to make these exhausts look nasty in a good way. Since this is Miniart's first kit, I was both excited and nervous. The cockpit tub did need some work for it to be able to fit. It does have different locating tabs and everything, but they just would not snap together as you would expect with some other manufacturers. But once you kind of trimmed it down, then it fit well. I decided to go with Art Scale Kit's fantastic 3D printed seat. Also comes with some seat belts, but we'll talk about that later. Now, before I put on my green, what I did is I laid down a base coat of aluminum, and then I just used some off-the-shelf hairspray to be able to use my hairspray chipping technique that will come later. So I decided to go with Tamiya LP31, which I think looks pretty dang close to the cockpit colors for some of the references, but it looks like they varied quite a bit when it comes to the color that they put in the cockpits. So now for the fun part, hairspray chipping. Now, I'm not a master at this, but basically what it comes down to is you're going to have a layer of hairspray in between your paint layers that's going to be attacked by water that you put over the top layer. So as I'm putting on water on top of the paint, it'll seep through and get down to the underlying layers, and that will then let the paint kind of flake off. Now there's a few additions that you can do to this. You can see it's a little bit resistant at the moment for anything. So what I can do is I can also take something sharp and kind of get it started. You can also scrape away a little bit of just the top layer. Use a 2500 grit sanding sponge if you want to just more use some kind of abrasion rather than a scratch or a complete flake off. Now, there's definitely an art to this. You want to make it so that it's not just one big chunk that just flies off, but actually look like, feet have been rubbing up against that and abrading off all of the paint coming off of it. So with it, you don't want to just have some big paint flakes coming off. You want to have some scratches, some places where it's worn down a little bit. You'll see me replicate this here, but your references are going to play a pivotal role in what you're going to aim for achieving. So here's a good example of replicating paint chipping away by chipping away at the paint. I'm just using something sharp, either a needle from an airbrush or an X-Acto knife, and just kind of scraping at a few raised edges, things that should be normally abrading, right? You can also do a 2500 grit sanding sponge like I was talking about and get more of that abrasion look. We'll do the same method on the sidewalls as well. Just trying to use either something that's sharp like an X-Acto knife or a needle out of an airbrush, something sharp that we can just make some fine scratches to it. Just try to pick out the high points on there, because those are generally what's going to get abraded, right? And get worn a little bit faster. But also add some scratches in there. If you're not sure exactly what it should look like, always look at your references like I just said. With each of these processes, the whole cockpit is starting to come alive. So I believe the technical term or name for this brush is a deerfoot stippler, but really all you got to do is just go down the craft aisle and you should see something similar to this. It's just a really crappy paintbrush. Now the Art Scale Kit seat comes with some really nice seat belts, and they're actually made by HGW, and they're amazing looking. However, very tedious. You got to actually loop through everything, through all the turnbuckles and everything, all the buckles. And after a couple nights, it was just a nightmare. So I decided to go in with the Kinta set, where this is very easy. So right now, what we got to do is remove all those details, because we got the seat belts. Might as well use everything else in the kit. Now the Kinta instrument panel is pretty amazing. There's a lot of really fine detail to it, but the Miniart set is not a bad set. You get individual decals for each of the dials, or one big sheet, and it's got a lot of the little placards to it, so there is a lot that just comes right out of the box. But the Kinta set does add just a little bit more authenticity to show that it's a busy cockpit. Now, normally what you would want to use with these decals to apply them is some PVA glue, but I was lazy, had some CA glue, so I just used some black CA glue. Definitely use at your own risk. I have ruined a project before because I glued Kinta seatbelts to my finger. And as you rip that off your finger, so comes all of the detail, and it looks atrocious, and you have to go buy a whole new set. So please just learn from my mistake. To bring out all the details, I'm just using Agrax Earthshade Citadel shader wash, whatever you want to call it. Works really good at bringing out all the details, and works as a good overall wash for certain areas like a cockpit where you just want to enhance and flow into some different crevices. And with this, if it ever becomes a bit too stark, which in some areas it looks a little bit too thick, just come with some Windex and clean it up afterwards. Now, since gravity is a thing, I am putting a pretty hefty wash on the floor of the cockpit, because that's where all the feet are going to be rubbing against, all the dirt and everything. And even if you look at some museum aircraft, outside looks gorgeous, but then you get a peek in the actual cockpit, and you notice they don't have very much volunteers that clean the inside of those cockpits. So the seatbelts, they look great, but a little bit too factory fresh. So that same Agrax Earthshade from Citadel applied over that, and then all the details make it look like it has a lot more depth to it and makes it look a bit more natural. Now, first you can see it's kind of a bit puddling in different areas, and it's maybe a bit too thick. So what you can do is you can move it around. You'll have a little bit of time to be able to kind of place just the right amount to get the right effect. If you ever have too much, you can either wick it away or thin it by using Windex once again. Now, keep in mind, this stuff does not work like a oil wash or enamel wash or anything like that. It's going to cure fairly fast, and it's going to be stuck there. You can use some Windex, like I've been saying, to kind of wash it and thin it and remove it, but you have to work pretty fast. If you use the Windex later and too late, it's going to come off in chunks. One last look before we say goodbye to the cockpit as we put it into the fuselage and hide some of these details from ever seeing the light of day again. So the good thing with this step is Miniart has some locating tabs that you can then put the cockpit, line them up nice and properly. For closing it together and getting it to line up can be a little bit tricky, but there is a little bit of a trick. Since we haven't put on the engine, what you can do is you can get it as close as you can and then look down and then kind of manipulate it with your finger and move it around so it then clicks into place. And then once you're there, it is pretty solid and a satisfying click just about happens. Now on to the glue sniffing portion of this build. Cockpit is still looking pretty busy. It's a good thing we have the different variation in there with the different seat belts and the different metal showing through and all the different red handles to add some variation to it. Otherwise it turns into this weird dark green void. Now it's a little bit tricky to see on here, but there's a lot of seam lines when it comes down to the exhaust pipes, so we'll have to go in and sand them out. Now the engine goes together pretty nicely. There's a few weird pipes with bending angles where it has to go around corners and you have to kind of manipulate them in place, but otherwise went together pretty easily. We're gonna add some ignition wiring to this. Since the face of the engine and the nacelle is pretty exposed, we want to dress it up as much as possible. It's not like a FW190 where it might be hidden and all that. So I'm just using solder. You can use some lead wire, but it's like $4 for hundreds of feet of this stuff, and it's pretty easy to find. So that's what I use. For each of these holes, you'll have to then drill the hole. They give you a little bit of a guide of where they need to be. And also with the instruction manual in the end, they actually show you where all those wires need to be added. So I thought that was a pretty neat addition to the instruction manual that I didn't have to go research myself. And with this, you can kind of see how the wiring goes. It'll go from the ignition coil up in the front to then go through the cylinder head piece and then back out and then up through whatever that mount thing is, and then all the way back to the front is the way that I had that wired. And you're going to repeat this process about 18 times because the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, that's a mouthful, had 18 cylinders. The cool thing with Miniart is they've molded the ignition harness pretty well to where you know where the wires need to go. And then you add that to the diagram that they also include and it makes it a lot easier to figure out where everything needs to go. Now to add a wash. So I'm using Citadel Null Oil shade and I'm just applying it just pretty liberally to there. If I ever put too much on, I can wick it away or I can use some Windex. And definitely sorry about the blurriness. My new camera that'll be in the next part is much better at the autofocus. And this is the point where you'll notice that my exhaust is super shiny. I don't know what reference I was looking at or what. Maybe because I was thinking how the super turbo works in this, that those wouldn't really get cruddy. Well, they do, and don't worry, we'll be fixing that in a sec. When it comes to the firewall, oh, these get super gruddy. So this time I'm using that Agrax Earth shade to kind of give it that brown, kind of grungy, greased up look. Now, whether or not this detail will ever see the light of day again, I don't know. Maybe if you look really close on the finished piece, you'll be able to see this, but I know it's there. Now these engine mounts scare the hell out of me. They are pretty small. I don't know if they're accurate to the real thing, But man, if they are, I can imagine that double WASP engine would just rip itself apart. I don't know what is truly holding it on to the frame. It's kind of interesting. Maybe the piping is most of the structure. I don't know. I'm gonna have to look at some diagrams. But for whatever reason, with the kit, you just have some really small attachment points. I'm locking them in place with some super glue and accelerating it. And I just hope and pray that the engine does not come off, because I'm not going to be putting on the nacelles. I want to have this an exposed engine. So I'm starting to get the feeling that anything that is cylindrical on this kit, I'm probably going to have plenty of cleanup. So for these oil coolers, yep, more seems to be filed away that maybe will never ever be seen again, but whatever. I cleaned them up and attached the photo etch part supplied with the kit. So now the part you've been waiting for, we're gonna dirty up those pipes. So I've got a set from Vallejo that comes with a bunch of different rust colors, and we're starting out with a chocolate brown, the color from Vallejo. So we're having that be kind of our base layer. And rather than take the whole thing apart, I'm trying to see if I can just paint those pipes with it still assembled. So now I'm adding some Vallejo light rust that's heavily thinned down and just putting them into a couple of strategic areas. Now for some Vallejo orange brown, and we're just going to put them into a couple random areas, and then we're going to attack it with a sponge and just kind of tap it before it dries, so it kind of creates that splotchy look where you get with rust, where it's not uniform, but you kind of just get it pigmented here and there. Now to add some of our favorite Nuln oil from Citadel, just let that kind of pool around all the different raised edges, and it's going to give it just a perfect shadow. Works really, really well for this. And if you think you have too much, once again, you can use Windex or window cleaner, or whatever you call it, something with ammonia. It'll be able to attack that. So it's really a process of add some, take some away, until it looks just the way you want it to. Now it's looking pretty good, but not quite there. We're going to employ my secret weapon. Got an old bottle of pigments from Wilder. This is old grease, and especially if you have that wash that's still a little bit wet, it'll stick to it really well and gives this really nice grungy look to the pipes where oil and grease have just kind of caked on and flung to it. At this point, there might be a little bit too much, so I'm using mineral spirits to just kind of move it around and kind of turn it more into a wash, and so it'll just stay off of the high points and move towards the crevices. On some parts, we'll want to replicate some fresh engine oil that's been on there. And so we're using the aptly named product from MIG, Fresh Engine Oil Wash. So putting that in and just putting into just a few strategic places where maybe that oil would stick. Seams. Why did it have to be seams? Actually, this kit's pretty good when it comes to cleaning up the seams, but we will need to attack a few certain points on here because we're going to make this into a natural metal finish, and any sort of ghost seam is going to show up super prominently on there. I'm using just rubberized CA, putting it into each of those crevices, letting it kind of soak in, and put it into anywhere. Looking at the bottom, plenty to work with seams. So we have a little bit of seam in that joint that we'll have to deal with, where especially it didn't go together super cleanly. That's my bad. But because otherwise the fit was really good with the cockpit tub and everything once you got it in there. Once the glue's cured, now we're going to do some sanding. As you can see right here is a little bit of a tight space to be able to sand these, and these ammo sanding sticks are amazing for that. Comes in a bunch of different grits. I'm going to first start with 240 and work my way up to some higher grits until that area is polished. I'm using one of the new AK paint markers. They work really well for this. The red, as you can see, isn't really red, so I'm using it for this, where I'll use a redder red paint for red stuff. We'll know that we've sanded enough when all of that red paint is completely gone. Now on the bottom, I can go in, I can use my big Infinity sanding sponges, and it'll make quick work out of these seams. Starting out with the 400 grit and then just working my way up higher to about 1500 grit, so it looks all nice and polished and ready to go. I'll change to the rubber black pen, and just to check out my seams, you can see that there are a few areas that still need some work. Looking pretty good, but a little bit more work is needed. We sanded away all of our detail, we got to restore it. Normally what I'd like to do is get like a razor saw or something like that, and then deepen the engraved details, and then also take like an old airbrush needle and poke the holes deeper in each of the rivet lines. But you know, I didn't do that on this, so now I have to completely scribe them from scratch. Thing that's going to help a lot is this blueprint that I took from a modeling magazine. It's going to tell me exactly where I need to put all these little rivets and restore each panel line. That's it for this part. In the next part, I'm going to be laying down some paint, prepping for some metallic finishes. and getting this to look like one cool, shiny, metallic bird. Welcome back, modelers, to part 2 of the build series for the Miniart P-47. Today we're going to be doing some metallic finishes. I'm going to show you how I'm going to put in a few different techniques to get a good finish on this, but also I'm going to do some experimentation to try to see if we can get also a little bit more of a patina to the finish. But first, I've got a correction sent in by a fan, John Colasante. So with the engine mountings, I was a little bit perplexed, and yeah, Miniart does it a little bit weird. On the photo, you can see that there is very much engine mounts, and you have a little bit of a deflector shield that doesn't really have much structure to it. So when you put together the kit, the way that attaches is a little bit funky, not exactly true, but everything behind that point is bare, and so I can kind of see why they did it, but now it makes total sense. Now before I move on to the painting stage, I'm going to add a little bit of plumbing. Cool thing with this Miniart kit is in the instructions, they will actually give you location, and there's actually a little bit of divots to where you would drill out and put these wires. So that was pretty nifty. Now they don't exactly tell you all of the wires, but it's pretty dang cool. Now after all that sanding, I killed a lot of the detail, so I'm gonna have to restore it here. I'm just using this rivet tool that's from Galaxy Tools, and it fits the pattern pretty well. For the leading edges, I'm using some rubberized CA glue, just kind of rubbing it all over that surface, and then I'm going to come back with it later with some sanding and make sure that I don't get any ghost seams coming through those. Now I found a bit of a nasty gap here where these two panels line, so I'm just putting in perfect plastic putty, letting it dry, and then coming back at it with some water to kind of clean it up, and then also a Q-tip to just clean up all the rest of the residue so it doesn't look as gigantic. For painting, I started out with Mr. Surfacer 1500, and I used Mr. Leveling Thinner MLT to thin that down, gave it a little bit of a sanding, and then now I'm coming back with it with a gloss black with the Tamiya lacquer. Now the first layer of this gloss black is not silky smooth, but we're going to have a bunch more layers of progressively thinner and thinner and thinner paint to it. Also, we're going to do a lot of buffing to make sure that in the end we have a really smooth, shiny surface. And there's a bunch of different ways and techniques that you can do to have a really glossy, smooth surface. The automotive modelers, they know a bunch of different ways to do this quite a bit better. This is just my particular way that I'm going to be doing it. So now to smoothen up the paint a bit after it's been drying for several hours, I'm coming with 1500 grit sanding sponge from Infinity. And I'm just trying to kill all the high points, make sure the orange peel kind of gets leveled down. It's going to look pretty ugly at first, but once we go through the other grits, it's going to look a lot better. So now we're moving up to 2500 grit from Infinity. And with this, I haven't found too much of a difference when I'm looking at going back and forth versus swirling patterns and all that. When I'm at this grit, maybe there is more to it. Also, the next thing is wet versus dry. More often I'll actually be using wet, but right now I'm just doing it with dry, and it's getting most of the job done. Next, I'm moving into a 3000 grit from 3M, and this is just sold with automotive stores, and it's also a bit of a sponge, and it is very effective. I was very pleased with this. So now we move on to a bit of the power tools section. This is a sponge used for polishing that I got off of Amazon. It came in a couple different durabilities or densities in that set. Found that this orange worked quite well, but also the real soft red one is also good. but you definitely don't want to move into the heftier ones like the blue or the green that it comes with. I've had a few situations where you just burn right through the clear coat, and you don't want that to happen. If it does, then you can just go through the process again and then just kind of call it oil canning. The other thing you don't want to have happen too is take note of the rotation of the bit and make sure that it doesn't catch on the edge, and otherwise it may fling your part across the room, it may damage it, and so kind of keep note of where it's spinning so it doesn't catch onto it and fling it. So now I'm moving on to a cotton wheel to do my polishing, and this is pretty worn, which helps out with the process. Some of the ones that are brand new might be a little bit more abrasive, I guess, and so this can work out real well. Now we're getting pretty close with our shininess or reflectivity. I'm not necessarily looking for something that is super mirror finish, because in the end we're not necessarily looking for paint that is going to be mirror finish in this build. If you do find some high points, some roughness, just go through the grits again. You don't want to go too low or too high with it, but just work out that orange peel until you have the right kind of reflectivity, the right kind of surface that you want to have in the end. The more shiny that surface is, the more reflectivity it's going to have, the more that the top coat, the metallic, is going to be shiny and reflective. So if you are going for a kind of restoration museum or something fresh out of the factory potentially, you want a super gloss, or maybe you're working on something that's chrome, then yeah, you need it to be super reflective for this to work properly with the next phase. At this point, definitely not perfect, but we're getting close to what we want. So back to the drawing board with some more polishing. At this point, I know you're going to say, oh, that is definitely not a mirror finish. Not perfect, but keep in mind, I'm not quite going for a perfect mirror finish on this particular one. So this kind of begs the question then, well, Cameron, what are you actually trying to achieve with this? Like I said, I don't want to have particularly a super shiny restoration or something from a museum like that. I also don't want it to look like the painted on silver. Especially when they look toy-like. That's definitely what I'm not looking for. So this is where references are going to help me a ton. This is the subject that I'm actually trying to portray. So I don't want to get into something that is fully aluminum oxide rough, the kind of MiG-21 derelict that you see just lying around. But I don't want to get into something that looks super rough. Don't want to be super clean. So somewhere in the middle, something kind of like this. So you can kind of get a little bit of an idea of what I'm looking for, but it may not be 100% achievable. Talking to a friend, maybe the only way that you actually can do this is have actual aluminum sheet on your model and do actual oxidation to it. Some of these references I know is from a video game, but I kind of liked still what they're trying to achieve there. So I try to look at all these and try to get a little bit of an idea. Maybe I'll get it in the end, but we'll have to see. That's part of the fun. So I've got a little bit of a theory of how I can maybe achieve this. I'm going to be using Amomig A-Stand paints. So I've got the high shine, I've got the airframe aluminum, got the dark aluminum, and then polished aluminum, and then the last one on there is going to be the high speed silver. So what I can do is maybe use how they have different reflectivities, different opacities, to be able to maybe achieve some different layers with that. So the high speed was pretty good with opacity, but you get that airframe aluminum and kind of transparent. The high shine was obviously the shiniest, and so that is what I'm going to be putting down here as my base. So this test is going to show you the 4 different layers that I've got, using masks as we go, and so on the far right, it's kind of what I'm hoping to achieve in the end, except for that corner. That was an experiment with dull aluminum. So after looking at the footage of this, I don't know if it's the new camera that's just got some really good quality to it or what, but obviously this is not the most smooth finish. Definitely not something that I would be using for automotive, but I think it will work for what we're trying to achieve here. But I promise I can paint a smooth surface, just whatever factors led to this. And the end result from where I've got to here is actually quite nice that we'll look at. So I'm just laying down some light layers of the High Shine Plus, and just laying that. That's going to be starting on my base coat, like I said. And with this, it's a little easier to use than the All Clad, but still got to have all the discipline. If you get too close with it, pressure too high, then the paint's going to look horrible. It's going to spider, it's going to pool. Sometimes it can even frost. And so make sure that you are being nice and careful and patient with the paint process. So after laying down the High Shine Plus layer, I'm putting on airframe aluminum. But I'm not gonna just lay it on that layer. What I've got is a little bit of a mask. So this is what I learned in my previous video, where this is basically just a seam strip that a lot of people that are into sewing would understand, but I don't know 100% what it is. But what it'll do is it'll create a cool little pattern where it's blocking the paint and allowing it to flow. And so for modeling effects, I found it is very excellent. So if we use that, maybe we can get a little bit of that splotchiness that you get into with some of the aluminum that has been oxidized. Now, one warning, just like any mask, if you're laying on too much paint and then it has wet, drippy paints absorbed into it, and you put that onto a surface with lacquer, where this is mostly lacquer thinner, it's going to eat into it and it's going to look pretty ugly. Now, maybe a little bit hard to see, but you can see a little bit of patina happening where it's creating a little bit of a shiny point, a little bit different reflectivity. You can also see on the vertical stabilizer a little bit of that frosting effect that I was talking about, but don't worry, if you just let it dry, you can buff it and you won't see it anymore. So I want to do a little more experimenting with a different mask. This is a splatter mask from Ushi. I like it because it's brass. You can basically have it last forever. You just keep on cleaning it and cleaning it with some kind of thinner, depending on what you have, and it works really, really well. Fortunately with this, you can see it's a little bit too stark. So I go back to that seam tape. So I'm moving over to the high-speed silver. This one is more opaque and it's not as shiny. So when we compare and contrast it that to the kind of the shinier levels, I think the effect is going to be pretty good. But to be totally honest, I'm in uncharted territory. Done this before. This is a lot of experimentation. And then this is the effect that we have from it. It's not quite where I want, but I think we're going in the right direction. Now with these A-stand paints, you can technically buff them. So I'm going to try that, see if I can blend in some things, maybe create a few effects. So play around with the good old cotton wheel from there. If you note here, I've added some high-speed silver to the wing root, and you can see the difference on there. It's pretty pronounced, and we're going to kind of use that a little bit to our advantage. And at this point, it looks a little bit blotchy. So what we're going to do is still use the mask, add some more layers, and try to blend that in a little bit better. We can also use a little bit of light coats to kind of blend that in of something a little more transparent like airframe aluminum. At this point, still not happy. Probably saying, Cameron, why? It looks good. But I want to add a little bit of more shiny tones back because I think I may have done too much of the high-speed silver and it looks a little bit too oxidized. So try to add some more shiny points to that. Now, I think we've gotten as much as we can when it comes to the metallics on here. So we're going to go ahead and seal it with some All-Clad Aqua Gloss. You could also use AK Gauzy if you would like. Now, this particular step can be a little bit of a debate. It does maybe kill a little bit of the reflectivity. On this particular build, I didn't really notice much of anything when I was going across. There's actually a few times where I had to really put it at an angle so I can actually see what I'm spraying, where it's actually getting coverage, because it is pretty dang transparent and it's made for this purpose. So in other situations, maybe you could get away with that, but with this, I'm gonna have a little bit of decals for the stencils. A lot of the markings I'm just going to do painted on, and so that's gonna look pretty good on top, but I've played around with some decals on top of it without any clear coat, and it just looks trash. You can totally tell there's a sheen difference, and so it just looks bad. Now, maybe there's some better decals out there. Maybe play around with the Eduard decals where you can remove the carrier film. That could be a pretty good solution, but this particular set, I'm gonna have to deal with a little bit of decals. So this is the point where I'm hoping having sub-assemblies is paying off with all the polishing and everything. And mostly, I think it was good, but the fit on the wing roots are not so great. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tack it in place, and then we're gonna use some putty here in a sec. Depending on your screen size that you're viewing this on, there is still a pretty sizable gap. So we're definitely gonna go in and fill that up with some putty. After all that work, I need to be a little gentle, so I'm not gonna be using any super glue or anything like that. Just going in with the perfect plastic putty, or Vallejo putty is pretty similar to it. So I'm just lathering it into that crack, and then gonna clean it up with water. We'll just spray high-speed silver over there, and it would just look like an oxidized wing root, and I think we'll be good. So after playing around a little bit with oils, I've got my test bed here, and I think I'm at a point where I like the finish. So we're gonna use that technique on the rest of the airframe. So I'm always open for some critique, so if you think I achieved it or something I need to do a little bit more, let me know in the chat and I'll maybe use it in the next video. The oil I'm going to be using is some cold gray color, just some basic artist oil, and a Princeton mini mop. Just applying that oil in dots, random areas, letting it get a little bit more dry, and then we're going to come back with the mop, kind of use some stippling action. So you're just going to continue with this stippling action, and you just keep doing that until it looks right. So how do you know it looks right? Well, it doesn't look like there's a technique there. It doesn't look like oils have been applied to the surface. So you're just going to be doing that tapping, and sometimes you might need to remove a little bit of the oil with a paper towel or something like that. Sometimes there may be just way too much and all you're doing is just smearing it around. So if that happens, then you can take the Q-tip or the brush and you can see me just like swipe it aside, remove it, and then just keep tapping and tapping and tapping until it looks like you just have some patina or a filter or just a little bit of that effect rather than, oh, it looks like there's a big old oil clump. And I think we're there. So looking pretty good. I'm gonna seal this with some aqua gloss. And then the next step is I'm gonna grab my masks that I made on my silhouette machine, try to paint on as much as I can with the insignia. And for any of the stencils that I want to put on, then I'm gonna use just the decals that I have for the project. So make sure that you subscribe and you do that bell thingy so you can be notified when part 3 drops. In today's video, I do something stupid, so you don't have to. And then I repair that bonehead move. Now let's see if you can guess where I messed up. Let's review what we did on the last video. So in the last video, it was all about the metallic finish. So we laid down a gloss black coat, and then we put down our different A-stand coats, and then we got into an oil layer to kind of give it a patina, and then we went to aqua gloss. So at this point I'm ready to do some masking. So I'm just using masking tape to just make some lines for the anti-glare panels. And for that I'm just using Tamiya Olive Drab in their lacquer lineup. To create a sun-faded effect, I'm using that same masking material from the previous video, and I'm using a lighter shade of the olive drab and laying that on. Now with that, it looks maybe a little bit too splotchy, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna come back with that same color and just kind of blend it in a little bit so it's not quite so stark. Now for the blue stripes, once again using Tamiya LP colors, and I've got it thinned down a little bit with some white. At this point, maybe it's a little bit too thin. That means we're gonna have a little more layers, and maybe I'm gonna add a little bit more dark blue to it. To mask up the canopy, I've got the art scale canopy masks for the inside and the outside. Now for the fun part. I scanned the decal set into my computer and then I added it into the Silhouette Studio and just traced the lines for it to make my own masks where I thought the fidelity could work. For the tail numbers, I'm using NATO Black. Definitely my favorite kind of black because it's not quite black, it's got a little bit of gray to it. Now for the part that you've all been waiting for. I'm gonna start peeling off the masks. And this one so far looks pretty good. So you can already see a spot where the masking tape did a bit of damage. Yeah, pretty good. You can see a little bit of tape peel with that. Now it is interesting as that layer is coming off, you can kind of see where the sheen is different when you remove the aqua gloss layer. So aqua gloss, yeah, definitely does change the reflectivity of that paint. So not too shabby. There's a little bit of touch up that needs to be done on the bottom there. Now to paint the inside of the canopy, I'm also using that same NATO Black from Tamiya. Now for the white portion of the insignia, I'm using MRP white. It's one of my favorite whites. Got really good coverage without kind of getting cloudy and thick. Now on this build, I'm doing things a little bit differently with my masking material. I'm using Oracal 813, where I've used 810 in the past and a few others. Could that be the reason that our tape is lifting the paint? Now I'm getting into that same mix of blue that I was using earlier, and yeah, it's coming out a little bit light, so we're gonna use this in darker colors to kind of create a little bit more of a distressed look. And at this point, it seems to be peeling off pretty well. I'm not really seeing any gigantic chunks coming off. Now we can start to see the effect of modeling past your bedtime. So we can see it just start to lift up all that white paint and go back down to the silver layer. And running into the same thing on the belly of this aircraft. And at this point, I'm probably not going to be doing much of a voiceover, because I'd probably just let out my frustrations, and, you know, this will become demonetized.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
So let's test this out. Could it be aqua gloss versus gauzy? Could it be my new stencil material? Or could it be that oil weathering that I did before putting on the aqua gloss? And there's our culprit. So is the oil weathering, which makes perfect sense. You know, oil doesn't like really a lot of things to stick to it, so it's going to make that paint lift up pretty well. The aqua gloss doesn't really have anything to bind into, and so it's going to lift up. Look how much comes off on this stencil material. The other thing too that I did after this to just make sure I'm running things a little bit better is I did detack the stencil material, but even still, it was really the oil weathering that really made all this disaster come to us. So to fix it, I'm polishing down those high points, and then we're gonna just reapply paint. But at this point, what I probably should have done is just grab maybe even some permanent masking material and just tear up paint basically, and then redo it. But I don't know, in the end it did come out okay. Just had to do a lot of different touch-up work to go over all those different screw-ups. So you can see I've switched over to the Oracal 810, but I don't think it really made too much of a difference. I think it's more about the stretchiness that it does. So I still detacked. But for the white, I'm switching now to SMS White Primer, because now I have to build up a little bit of layers with the edges of that paint where it ripped off, and getting a little bit creative. And I think this is also probably about midnight as well, so getting a little bit desperate as well. Also, I failed to mention, I was trying to get this done in time for the Salt Lake City show. Looking back, I probably just should have taken my time, being a little more methodical and not try to be under the gun, so to speak. I probably wouldn't have been running into these mistakes. But then we wouldn't have this video for your viewing pleasure, where we are going to show me some humility. With each masking job, we're getting a little bit better and better, but you can see still we got to do some more work. Well, let me know what you think. Did I fix this problem properly? Would there been a better way? Do you think I should have just tried to use masking tape to just kind of rip off those layers so I go back down to the L-clad and have a little bit better base to get to? Or would you want me to go maybe full on acid attempt and just like completely wipe all the paint and start all over? So now I'm adding a layer of aqua gloss to give me a little bit more protection. Not sure if it really is doing much of anything, but you know, it makes me feel a little bit better. Now I've got a weird effect in all those areas where the tape peeled and maybe it got down to the ultra high shine layer, and now there's a difference. So I'm coming in with some different A-stands. I think at this point I'm doing an airframe aluminum to just kind of touch up that one point. But then the high-speed silver is going to cover up some of my sins. So some areas had a pretty big chunk taken out of it, so I wanted to build it up a little bit more, add some black paint, and then we're going to polish that until we can't really notice that anymore. Now I've added the stencils off camera because it's boring, let's be honest. But what I'm doing is you can see definitely the decal edges, so I'm blending it in with some aqua gloss. That's a lot of aqua gloss, so I'm cleaning it up here. But just try to blend in those areas so it doesn't look like an actual decal is there. So this is the end of part 3. Hopefully you had some fun making fun of me at my expense. But lesson learned for everybody, I would assume. In the next video, we're going to go over weathering. And so you can see me adding that nice panel wash that's super satisfying. Make sure that you're subscribed and notified so you know when that will drop. So after our mishap that we had in our last video, we're going to finish off this project by getting into some of the details. To paint the gun bay, I'm just using Vallejo brass, and I'm trying to be a little bit precise, but it doesn't quite matter because we're going to cheat by using a wash later. Now to replicate copper, I just add a little bit of red to the brass and it does the job. Now to finish it off, I'm just using some graphite powder to kind of make all the gun barrels and the links look a little bit more gunmetal. Now here is where I'm going to be able to hide all my sins. So I'm just using Citadel Null Oil Wash, and when we put that in, I'm going to of course clean this up a little bit, but it's going to kind of hide some of the delineation between the yellow and the brass, and so it doesn't quite look so bad. Now I know what you're thinking, that's a lot, but don't worry, I can wick it away. It's not the end of the world. Now some of the decal film is still showing a bit, so I'm using a 3000 grit sanding sponge to just kind of blend that in a little bit better, and so you can't see the edge. So now for my favorite part, the oil wash. I'm just using mineral spirits and Starship Filth, just kind of letting it flow into all the different cracks. Gonna put it on a little bit thick, and then we're gonna clean up a little bit more later. And then this is my favorite part, just putting the wash over that insignia really makes it look like it's just popping and coming to life. So I've got a specialized Q-tip here that I'm using, and it's got a little bit of mineral spirits on it, and I'm just kind of dragging it along as you go through the flow of airflow along the fuselage, and it creates a really good effect. But what we want to do is just try to remove anything that just looks like a big tide mark or anything looks out of place, and just remove until you have just the right amount of oil on the surface. Now if you get impatient like I am right here, you can just be able to use some paper towel and send in the same method and remove all that excess a lot faster. The good thing with oils is they're very forgiving. If I go in and I remove too much, okay, then I can just put back on more oil. If it has too much, then I can easily remove it. And so we can go back and forth until we have just the right mix. Right now for some streaking, So I'm just using black oil as well and just kind of making a haphazard line, and then just drag along the surface to remove until there's just kind of a faint line. And so you can see on the left where I started out with, where there's a lot of oil on there. And then on the right wing, we have it almost removed. And like I said, don't worry if you remove too much, you can always add it back. So doing the same thing for the top of the flaps, but just keep in mind it's usually not quite as dirty because, you know, gravity's a thing, and so keep that in mind. And so here's where we are at this point. A few things to clean up a little bit, but looking pretty good. Now to work with some inks for the exhaust and a few other places. Now I started switching over to some like the AK and the Liquitex inks and been pretty impressed, but I might go back to some of the other stuff that I've used in the past that is more of a filter. But what it allows you to do is if you thin it down and dial down your air pressure, you can create a really good smoky effect. Now this part is actually part of the exhaust. From references, it gets pretty cruddy and dirty just like anything else with exhaust, and so we'll be using this black on there too. Now looking at my references, the geared door gets pretty charred from that exhaust, and it makes a really cool effect, so I wanted to replicate that with some of the inks as well. This part I'm switching over to a brown kind of raw sienna type mix. And also adding that raw sienna mix to the exhaust as well. Now switching back to black, I'm just adding a little bit of soot to the end of each of the gun pipes, and then also a little bit coming out of the ejector shell ports. Now for some more oils. So I'm grabbing that dark gray oil, and I'm just blotting on into certain areas on the wing. What that's going to do is give us a little bit more of an oxidized look in those areas. So now I'm grabbing my mop brush and getting into some stippling. So just keep on poking at it, and what we want to do is obviously not make it look like it's actual oil to the surface, but just enough to where it's kind of changing the color. So almost like a targeted filter in a way, but not overall, just in certain haphazard stippled areas. So you should notice that I'm changing to a bigger mop because it's going to give a little bit of a different effect, because we're trying to create a lot of variety. So this is then replicated in other parts of the airframe. So here I'm mixing the dark gray with some sand, and that's gonna make our dust effect. So I'm just tapping that into some of the roots, and especially the wing root, and anywhere that people are walking on. And we're gonna just kind of do the same exact process as we did with the gray. You can also create a little bit of rain streaking type patterns on the sides of the fuselage that really, I think, add a really cool detail to it. Now don't forget about the bottom of the wings. You're going to have all sorts of different dirt and dust that's going to get flipped up from the wheels, and different things that are going to leak out of the wheel wells. So we definitely need to take care of those. Now the way that I like to paint my props is generally starting out with some kind of aluminum, dark steel, some kind of metallic, and then putting black, and then also different shades of NATO black that we'll get into. Now after the black, I'm going to use my filter and paint NATO black. And some of these will actually have a little bit of a grain to it. You can kind of do a little bit of that with the flow of the air, and can be really convincing. And then freehand, I'm just painting that NATO black onto the rubber boots to kind of give it a little bit more of a contrast, since, you know, they're rubber. Now switching over to the bombs, gave it an olive drab base, and then now I'm using a little bit more of a yellowish tint to it through that filter. That's going to give it a nice kind of worn contrasty look. Now to go the other direction, I'm using my filter to paint a brown to the surface. So at this point it's looking a little bit stark and splotchy, but with the next step, it'll get just there. So now I'm going over it with some really light olive drab to kind of tone down what we just did so it looks a little bit more natural. And here's the result of our efforts. But we're not done yet. Got to get some oils. So I'm just using a sponge to apply haphazard oils into just random places onto the bomb. So now I'm grabbing a damp mop and just stippling it to make it look a little bit more like it's naturally applied dust rather than with a sponge. Now to give the wheels a little bit of a dust treatment. Starting out just with that sand color and just applying it all over. Then we're gonna use a few different shades to kind of make it a little bit more natural and not just monochromatic. So we're going in with a little bit of a lighter color because we want to make it a little bit more realistic. When you have your dirt, it's always not really just monochromatic. There's a little bit of different coloration to it. Also, I doubt that this airframe is only going to be taking off and landing in one area. Since my aim is to have a dusty wheel and not a muddy wheel, I'm removing most of the oil with this Q-tip. And I'm just kind of taking it from the center and just dragging it to the outside, as centrifugal forces kind of will do that with the dirt and mud. And at this point, I should talk about how I am now accepting donations to the Cameron's Manicure Fund. As you can see, pretty necessary. Now to remove all the different stuff on top of the treads, because we kind of want to just to have the dust stick in between the treads only. So I failed to mention, this is the Art Scale Kit's 3D printed tires, and you can see like the Goodyear logo on it. Really good. The kit tires were actually pretty good, and I like how they can have the option for like an actual sag on them. These don't, but in the end I decided to go with a little bit crisper detailed tires. Faster way to remove all that excess oil is just twist the tire like it naturally would inside a paper towel, and what comes out in the end is pretty lifelike. And here's our end result. For the prop, I'm just using 1500 grit sanding sponges, and I'm just running them along the leading and trailing edges of the prop where it's going to be getting all that wear. And what I should have done is added a little bit of a clear barrier coat in between the metallic and the black, because there's a few parts where I did sand through that. But in the end, it wasn't really hard. All I had to do was airbrush some metallics to just cover up those different points where the plastic came through. And here's our end result. So if you remember from the previous video, I was saying that I was kind of rushing a few things because I wanted to get it done for a contest that, you know, it didn't win anything in, but whatever. But I was able to actually finish it in time. And so there is a few things that I do need to change that has been called out off of the internet. The landing gear doors, they're backwards. And then the gun bays, where not for the ammunition racks, but where the actual guns are, that is not on a hinge. So it's just kind of floating there, and that needs to be changed. I might do a little bit more tweaking with a few other things, but those are the only things that have really been called out. So let me know what you guys think. Is it something where I achieved what I was looking for, or, well, back to the drawing board and we're going to have to try again with another one?